Give it a moment.
Are we going to see them or no?
No.
Okay.
Okay. Welcome everybody to ULI Westchester Fairfield's presentation today on affordable housing entitled Red Light, Green Light. This series will analyze the effects of financial tools and the impact on residential development. We're thrilled that you're able to join us this afternoon. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Holly Hasbrook, who's a member of our ULI Westchester Fairfield District Council, and she's going to give an introduction to the program.
Thank you, Mara. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Holly Hasbrook, VP of Sales at Stewart Title. We're a longstanding ULI sponsor of our local chapter, and on our screen are the other annual sponsors and our event sponsors today, Goldstein Hall and Mission Title. I'm honored to be kicking off the second session of the Women's Leadership Affordable Housing Series. I would like to thank our committee members, Cheryl Patterson-Zake, Joanna Cuevas, also one of today's panelists, Robin Seltzer and Kate Kerrigan. Our last session was a vigorous discussion with leaders in the public and private sectors. Their narratives may be slightly different, however, the need is the same. There is not enough affordable housing in our communities, and in particular, affordable housing for aging seniors. Yonkers has a waiting list of over 6,000 people. Almost a third of the seniors on the waiting list is closed, and almost a third of the waiting list are seniors. Our panelists spoke about the challenges of fitting affordable housing into our suburban communities and the need to build where the jobs are. We also discussed form-based code, using form-based code to limit cost and collaborating and creativity with both the private and public sectors as being essential. Additionally, we discussed the challenges of educating the community in the overall economic benefits of affordable housing and the difference between tax credit and inclusionary housing. Today, our panel will focus on financing affordable projects. Our next session on March 25th will drill down to the local level and discuss pilots and why tax abatements are necessary to make projects economically available. And now I would like to introduce our moderator, Caroline Barry, Partner and Director of Asset Management at Jonathan Rose Companies.
Hi, well, thanks for joining us today. I'm really pleased to have representatives from the many different sectors within affordable housing today. So we're going to just take a couple minutes for each of the panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Joanna Cuevas.
Hey everyone, I'm Joanna Cuevas with the NHP Foundation. I want to thank ULI for hosting this event in the Affordable Housing Series. Very exciting for us all to get together, as Caroline said. Just as a quick introduction, the NHP Foundation was launched in 1989 as a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving and creating sustainable, service-enriched, multifamily affordable housing. We have 57 properties in nearly 10,000 units in 16 states and the District of Columbia. And we also provide services to our residents through the Operations Pathways program. So it is a multifaceted development group. Oh, Caroline, I think you're muted.
Still muted, Caroline.
Okay, Drew Foster.
Thank you. My name is Drew Foster. I am Senior Vice President of Investor Relations at Alliant Capital. Alliant is a multifaceted, multifamily investor and developer based in Woodland Hills, California. We also have offices throughout the U.S., founded in the late 90s, initially as just a tax credit syndicator, and has grown and expanded into a few different arms. One, development. We have 10 joint venture development partners that are all focused on the affordable development space in different markets throughout the country. And then we also have a group called Alliance Strategic, which is a preservation housing fund where we will purchase and invest in naturally occurring affordable assets, a space that some of our competitors like PNC Bank, National Equity Fund, and several others have been expanding into over the years. And then we also have an Opportunity Zone Fund as part of that as well. I oversee the capital raising, investor relations, fund management efforts just on the low-income housing tax credit piece. We have about $8 billion of assets under management on the LIHTC side. And we have gotten to the point now where our assets, we're also disposing of about 50 assets on an annual basis. So our portfolio, as it's matured, and since we've been in business for 23 years doing the tax credit stuff, we're seeing a lot on the front end and the back end of the business, and have developed an appreciation for what it means to have to contend with some of the issues that may have been overlooked on the front end, and puts us in a strong position to be able to address those properly on our new investments.
Thanks, Drew. Jason?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Thanks to the ULI for having us. Thank you, Caroline, for moderating. I'm Jason Lebate. I'm an attorney with Goldstein Hall. We are a law firm and a certified B Corp. If you don't know what that is, check it out. Super cool. Matching mission with profit. And we have offices in DC, Manhattan, New Rochelle, and Albany. We work primarily in affordable housing and community development, do all manner of complex real estate, corporate and not-for-profit work. And I think we've had a few projects in Connecticut, and we hope to do more, but most of our work is in New York State.
Great. Masuda Omar.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Masuda Omar. I am the Managing Director with the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, which is the state housing finance agency for the state. I've been in this role for just about a year now. We have two main lines of business, single family and multifamily. On the single family side, we provide low-cost capital, including down payment assistance for first-time home buyers. On the multifamily side, we administer federal and state tax credit programs, as well as provide direct financing to affordable housing developments in Connecticut. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you this morning, and thank you to ULI for hosting this session.
Thank you. And we also have Ayana Wagner.
Hi, my name is Ayana Wagner, and that's okay. I am the Downstate Development Director with New York State Homes Community and Renewal. It is the state's housing finance agency. Thank you very much for having me, ULI, and also Caroline for hosting. HCR, as it's known, does a number of things, but multifamily housing, home ownership, community revitalization, and rent regulation and tenant protection. I look forward to this discussion today and to be being with all of you.
Thank you. And Ayana, that reminds me, I'm going to be using my reading glasses while I ask the questions today. So I'm really pleased to be well represented here by both New York and Connecticut, as well as the public and private sectors. The way that all of us would like to conduct this is, as we're speaking, please feel free to enter some questions into the chat. If we can answer some as we go along the way, we will. And then we'll try to reserve a little time at the end to take some of the questions that we may have missed along the way. We would really love for this to be a free-flowing dialogue between us and with you. So with that, we're here to talk about affordable housing finance. And as so many of you know, the low-income housing tax credit tool is by far the primary source of financing for affordable housing. We typically use 9% for new development and 4% for acquisition rehab. Sometimes the 4% can be paired with other gap financing for new construction. We don't see that though as often. So hopefully the panelists can answer more questions about the availability of affordable housing financing at large. And so with that, I wanted to pose the question to the panelists. Have they seen an increased demand in tax credits over the last couple years, particularly for the 9% tax credits?
Sure. So this is Ayanna, and I can jump in on that. So just to take a quick step back, I'm not sure who all is in our audience, but low-income housing tax credits is a federal program. It's pursuant to Section 42 of the Internal Revenue Code, and it basically provides dollar-for-dollar reduction in a taxpayer's income liability in exchange for a long-term investment in affordable housing. New York State the states administer the program, and for New York State, it's Homes Community and Renewal HCR where I work. As Caroline mentioned, there is both the 9% and the 4% tax credit programs. So I should say I've only been at HCR in this role since the end of October. So I started basically when the fall 9% round was kicking off. And from what I'm told, having 94 applications in one round is a lot. So I would attest to the fact that there is an increased demand. And now that that application period is ended and it's in reviews, lots of folks are giving me a call for 4% with their projects that they want to apply for that for the March round. So I think it's a couple of things. I mean, obviously, the budget constraints that the government is going through as a result of the impact of the economy from the pandemic is pushing people towards developers towards looking at tax credits as subsidies is, not as available as it has been previously. And I guess I would just say in terms of New York State that we are at the end of our 5-year housing plan, but do anticipate and look forward to hopefully a 5-year plan being put into effect for next year.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And these programs continue to evolve in sort of more specific ways. There's been movement around making the 4% tax credit a fixed rate. Could you speak a little bit to the advantages of that?
Sure.
The
This
whole
is
audience? Yeah. Or Masuda, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I can start, and Drew, feel free to jump in. But before I do that, I also just wanted to talk a little bit as far as demand for 9% credits in Connecticut. Yeah, sure. So unlike New York, Connecticut is a small state. So we receive about 10 million of, just roughly a little over 10 million of annual allocation authority for the 9% program. So what that often translates into about 15 to 18 projects competing in any given round. Of that, about 5 to 7 are selected. So they're not as big as some of the other states. But by design, the 9% program is intended to offer deeper affordability, typically serving individuals and households that are 50% of AMI and under. For this particular round, we are oversubscribed by a ratio of 2 to 1. Again, we have 15 applications and we're expecting awards to be announced sometime here in early spring. So shifting gears to the 4% fixed rate, this is exciting news. We have been waiting for this for many, many years now. So for those that have been in affordable housing, like I said, this is welcome news. And so what the 4% is doing, it's effectively fixing the value at 30%, which should have been the intent all along. And as mentioned earlier, the 4% is a tool that's used primarily for acquisition and rehab, while in some areas you can do new construction, but generally it tends to be more of a preservation tool. So the 4% fixed rate, it covers both acquisition and development, as well as, and 4% is paired with private activity bonds or tax exempt bonds. So this legislation, again, covers both acquisition as well as developments that are funded with tax exempt bonds, and they have to be placed in service after 12/31/2020. So for those projects that have not, that are still in the application or underwriting stage, we are seeing those developments kind of going back to the drawing board and redoing their analysis to take advantage of the 4% fixed rate. There's a lot of conversation in the industry, and I would be interested in Drew's feedback as well in terms of the intent. It has created some questions as far as, so we believe that there may be some IRS guidance coming down the pipeline, because bonds are issued in various different methods by housing and finance agencies or housing authorities. So there is some determination and clarification to be made, but just in terms of just illustrating what the value means. So let's say you have a $10 million development under the prior to the rate getting fixed. Let's say they were getting a credit percentage of 3.10%. That would have translated into an annual credit amount of about $248,000. Let's say that investor was paying 95 cents on the dollar. Under the current fixed rate, that same $10 million development is now calculated at 4%. That generates $320,000 in annual credit. Let's say multiply that by 91 cents price per credit. So that's about $556,000 of additional equity that this particular development can benefit from. That being said, because there is a supply that's being created in the marketplace, investors are going back and looking at equity pricing. What we're hearing right now is a reduction of anywhere from 3 to 4 cents. Some deals may be a little more depending on the complexity of the transaction. So there is going to be an impact on pricing, but it's also generating a lot of questions in terms of, again, how is that additional proceeds being used? Is it going to pay the developer fee? Is it actually going to benefit the project in terms of improving the development? Is it being used to reduce the debt financing? So like I said, there's just a lot of questions right now that the industry is trying to get their arms around it. But overall, this is really good news, and we're really excited that this rate has now finally been fixed. So,
Great.
Drew, is there anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I think that, Masuda, what you said, I think is very accurate and represents exactly where the market is in terms of receiving this benefit of the 4% tax credit. On the investment side, we are definitely trying to address this in a way that is going to balance this huge added supply of credits that the market is seeing, and with what is somewhat of a tempered demand on projects that are already underway. In many cases, projects that have closed, they, for the most part, will not benefit from this 4% fixed credit. So it's really only applying, and the intent from the legislative standpoint was for it to only apply starting January 1st, 2021, moving forward. So it's not supposed to be retroactive. And what we're doing now is we are doing exactly what Masuda represented, which is we are adjusting pricing. And the reason that is necessary is because what is happening is the investor is receiving additional tax credits that they're paying for, but they're not receiving any additional, any other losses or other benefits from the project. All of that is static. So ultimately, it's just diluting the IRR by having to pay for more credits, but not get offsetting additional losses and depreciation from the project being larger. And then in some cases, especially where there's a lot of soft financing, most of that equity, additional equity, is going to reduced soft funding, which is a very positive thing, I think, broadly. So the investor community, what we're just trying to do is keep things stable and be made whole. We're certainly not looking to try and to capitalize this in a way that's going to benefit the investors more. We see this, at least from our perspective, as an opportunity to really improve the structures of transactions, some of the underwriting criteria that may have been pushed because construction costs have gone up a lot, and it's just adding more overall value and cushion in deals that make it better for the agencies, make it better for the developers, and make it better for the investors.
Yeah, and from a developer's perspective, we have seen some reduction in pricing, in conversations with our investors, but that has still created an increase in equity for the projects, as Drew mentioned, to stabilize it, to fill maybe some of the gaps that we've seen, to offset increased construction costs or relocation costs as resulting from COVID, in this previous year that were unexpected. So overall, even though there does seem to be, we've seen about on average a 2-cent reduction in pricing in some of our discussions with the investors. But again, still producing increased equity, which is helping to close.
That was such a great in-depth response from all of you, so thank you. There's another tool that's been made available through the program, and that's income averaging. Would you be willing to take that one on?
Sure.
Thank you.
Drew, do you want to take it or do you want me to? I can kick it off. It's up to you.
Yeah, why don't you kick it off, and I'd love to hear what you have to say first, especially given where things stand with the most recent regs. So
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to keep it really high level because it's complicated. So basically with average income, it was passed in 2018 as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act. It creates a third set aside. So under the Section 42 tax code, you have two set asides, 20% of the units serving households at 50% of AMI and under, or 40% of the units serving households at 60% of AMI and under. So what income averaging does is, again, it's a third set aside that is now available. And as long as the average is still 60% under, that development can have, unit designations ranging anywhere from 10% of AMI up to 80% of AMI. So the main benefit is it widens the bandwidth, because now you're able to not only serve those who are the lowest on the income bracket, as well as those that may previously didn't qualify for tax credit housing because their income was above 60% of AMI. Now they're able to reside in a tax credit development. Again, they could earn up to 80% of AMI as long as that average is 60% and under. In Connecticut, we do allow income averaging as a set aside. We also allow it for mixed income developments. There have been a handful of developments that have taken advantage of it. Part of that is just been the complexity more on the operational side and monitoring side. Most recently, IRS issued some guidance. Prior to that, the industry was kind of trying to figure out how best to handle the compliance monitoring. Now that the IRS guidance, or at least the draft guidance, are up for public comment, it is very clear that the IRS interpretation is much more restrictive than what the industry had thought. So it is kind of creating a lot of conversations, uncertainty among the development community, whether income averaging is the right choice for some of the developments. But I would say if we kind of step back, average income is a great tool, especially in high cost areas or in areas where you really want to have that income diversification. And so it's a tool that we don't want to necessarily lose sight of it. At the same time, it's also becoming more complex in terms of on the monitoring side. So you want to make sure that you're building a cushion. So maybe you don't want to go all the way to 60%. Maybe your cushion is more like 57% average or 58% average, so that you're not at risk of, being out of compliance with that development. So like I said, again, right now we're just trying to kind of understand the IRS guidance. IRS is going to be holding a public comment period soon. They've received a lot of feedback from the development community on the implications. So we're just kind of waiting to see which way IRS is going to go at this point. Yeah, so let me stop there and turn it to Drew or anyone else on the panel that wants to chime in.
Yeah, thank you, Masuda. So the average income test, which was added as an additional set aside, was really received as an exciting new addition several years ago. And once the community felt like it was comfortable enough understanding at least the initial the initial legislation that was provided, started moving forward with trying to build in some protective cushions in the instance that that compliance became a bigger issue than we sort of understood. And part of the problem was that this was written initially in a way that outlined basic assumptions, but didn't go into the level of detail that was necessary for the proper monitoring and focus, and that if there were an audit and somewhere were to be determined out of compliance, there was no precedent set to remedy these situations. And ultimately, the risk at the end of the day is a recapture of the tax credits, and that's what this all came down to. So, without fully understanding what the true risk was, investors were, of course, reluctant to move forward with the income averaging set aside unless they knew that there was a lot of breathing room to ensure that the compliance was not going to be breached. You fast forward to a few months ago, the IRS issued some renewed guidance that the industry was hoping would clarify and improve upon some of the initial legislation. Turns out it actually made things even more stringent and more confusing in a way that has put many investors and developers in a position where they say it's not worth doing, that it's just that the risk is greater than the potential reward. And the belief is that you just have individuals at the IRS that are writing and kind of putting out this guidance that don't really understand the true intention or the mechanics of what it means to operate these properties. So the hope is that the industry lobbying groups, like the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition, which has been heavily involved in drafting this initially and now trying to improve upon it, is going to be able to get some revised guidance that will allow us to fully understand what the intention is and what the true risk of a breach of compliance would mean. Without that, in many cases, it's sort of we're hitting a pause on moving forward with new projects that have income averaging in them. We are closing on investments that we're committed to. We have some investors in the industry that are still moving forward with caution, but I think we've hit a point where we have several of the largest investors in the nation that have said that they won't do new deals that have income averaging included, which is troublesome because that was not the intent. And I think we all are very supportive of it conceptually. It's now just getting the language correct to ensure that we're protected from a compliance standpoint.
Thank you. Ayana, could you briefly describe the QAP process and how some of the priorities of the QAP might be or have been changing in New York?
Sure, no problem. So the QAP is a qualified allocation plan, and it basically it's a document that formally sort of outlines how HCR administers the low-income housing tax credit program. So there are parameters, and it has to include information such as selection criteria, allocation process, compliance monitoring procedures, and that sort of thing. There is a QAP for both the 9% low-income housing tax credit program and the 4% low-income housing tax program. So in terms of priorities, and I would say that's included in both the QAPs as well as the 9% RFP that we issued about twice a year. It's things like community renewal and revitalization. So does the local municipality where the development is going to be housed have a specific goal or priority in mind that we would be, this would be supportive of? Housing Opportunity Program, HOP, that's a priority. That's for family housing, to support family housing, but particularly in neighborhoods where there are high performing schools. So we want to have affordable housing that allows for children to benefit from high-performing schools and great education. TOD, transportation, transit-oriented development, I should say. That is just because we know, folks folks need to be able to get to work, and so the proximity to affordable housing to transit is really important, and so that is a priority we want to support. And I could go on, but these basically are all outlined in the QAP. I would say that supportive housing and senior housing are very big priorities, as evidenced by the inclusion of funding in the state budget that was just put forward, that will be hopefully approved in April. And so there continue to be, I guess the other thing I wanted to point out is sort of environmental energy efficiency is a really big priority. It was actually included as an update in the latest 9% RFP for projects that would include additional energy efficiency that would sort of be in line with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act by the federal government. So all of those are outlined again in the RFP and in the QAP, and really do give you direction as to how to put forward your application and what the state wants to see in building affordable housing around the state.
Great, thank you, Ayana. Masuda, anything to add about the evolving priorities in Connecticut?
Sure. Yeah, I would say the QEP, I mean, as Ayana mentioned, it's really a roadmap in how we allocate this limited resource here in Connecticut. So in terms of our priority areas, we do look at rent affordability. How is this development targeting as far as deep affordability, supportive housing, mixed income housing? We do look at proximity to transit, sustainable design, opportunity areas. So, just overall construction design. So I would say QAPs in general kind of tend to have, especially for the 9% program, very stringent criteria, because it is a competitive resource as far as how, again, those resources get allocated. We do offer one round for the 9% program. And again, we get about 10 million of allocation authority. We also work closely with the Department of Housing here. And the Department of Housing provides the soft funding. So CDBG, home, as well as state soft funding for affordable housing developments. And for the current 9% round, the state is allocating 20 million of state resources that can then be paired with those 9% applications that are competing.
Great. Thank you very much. So what you both describe in short is that it's important as we develop affordable housing that it's part of a holistic plan to create high quality housing in neighborhoods where individuals have equitable access to work or to school. That makes sense. Masuda, you had mentioned supportive housing as well. And, from the perspective of providing a holistic approach to housing, could either one of you, Ayana or Masuda, speak to any potential for funds moving forward for supportive services within housing?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, the governor's budget included an additional allocation this year for $186 million of SHOP, that is Supportive Housing Opportunity Program funding. In addition, Homeless Housing and Assistance Program, that's HHAP or HAP, that was an additional $64 million. So we hope that those will be passed, but that's an example of the commitment to supportive housing development in the state. In terms of services, the ESHI award letters, that is the program that the Empire State Supportive Housing Initiative, that they every year fund the supportive housing services that we know are so necessary for often successful supportive housing developments. And so those awards were recently made, and we believe that there will be continued funding for ESHI going forward.
Thank you for further highlighting that. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Yeah, so in Connecticut, as far as for the supportive housing developments, the developers often partner with either a public housing authority who's able to bring project-based vouchers, or they can go directly to the state and secure Section 811 vouchers for those units. In terms of service funding, it can come from a couple of different ways. It can come through the operating budget, by having the developer partner with a service provider who's receiving state funding, or they can also build that operational budget through the tax credit program. That being said, I understand that one of the things that Connecticut is pursuing right now is using the Medicaid, getting a waiver for the Medicaid program, where Medicaid funds could be used to fund that service package. That is something that is not been approved yet, but if it does get approved, it will be, I believe it will be, Connecticut will be the first state in the nation to adopt this, which would be welcome news because it will obviously broaden that resource. So right now, those are kind of how developers are getting the service funding.
Great, thank you. So many of us understand that tax credit funding alone is not necessarily enough to build an entire building, and gap financing programs are oftentimes needed. Ayana and Masuda, would you like to just briefly speak to a couple of the gap funding sources available?
Sure, I can start. So in Connecticut, we have, again, the Department of Housing, who is the primary entity that provides soft funding, be it, CDBG, home funding, or state dollars. Those funds have been competitive just because of the growing demand for affordable housing. However, one of the things that we're trying to improve upon is just more coordination with the Department of Housing and the development community in selecting projects. So earlier last year, the Department of Housing and CHFA went through a process called the Developer Engagement Profile, or DEP. And this was really an opportunity to hear from the development community to submit a profile of what their development is about, just giving us an opportunity to understand what kind of pipeline of projects that are out there, what the need is. And so during the course of last year, we had over 160 respondents, and we had calls with those applicants just to kind of understand again what they were proposing and what developments they have in their pipeline. So like I said, DOH is primarily the funding source here. Developers can also, in some cases, get funding, through a local jurisdiction, like CDBG or home, but generally those dollars stay through the Department of Housing. CHFA also administers a state tax credit program. It's the Housing Tax Credit Contribution. We receive about 10 million of allocation authority from the state. This program has been around since 1987. A developer can get up to 500,000. It can be used for workforce housing, affordable rental program, home ownership. The recipient has to be a nonprofit, so this may not work for a for-profit developer, but certainly some of our nonprofit developers have been able to access the state tax credit program as another way to fill their financing gap. So those are the resources in Connecticut.
Great. Ayana, do you want to take a moment?
Sure. I would just, same, New York State has its own state housing low-income tax credit program. So that's another source of funding. There are also, depending on the type of project that you're building, a number of programs that apply both to the 9% and 4%. And so I would just say, if you are seeking to develop in New York, going to the HCR website for each of those programs and sort of just taking a look at the various term sheets for the programs is important, because it sort of depends on what it is you're trying to develop. And I'd also point out, there's their federal affordable housing and community investments. So the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which also is an important source of gap financing for a number of projects.
Great. And Jason, anything you wanted to add to that? I should have asked you sooner.
Yeah, no, no problem. So I'm not exactly sure how sophisticated our audience is. So I think I'll take this opportunity to sort of provide the legal perspective on things, if that's okay. I don't know if people are familiar with sort of how these funds organizationally and mechanically need or get into the project. So just briefly, I wanted to, I guess, talk about some of the subsidies that that have been mentioned already, and then what the structures need to be like in ownership in order to facilitate that. And I'll try to do that very quickly because the law can be boring, so I try to talk fast to keep people awake and also not evidence what I don't know. So I will try to share my screen if that's okay, without turning myself into a cat. I hope everyone got to see that.
It's terrible.
It
That
is
poor
so
man.
good. Okay, did that work? Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Great. So just very quickly, again, some financing was discussed. This is generally what a low-income housing tax credit deal needs to look like. And I want to pause for a second. Most of these projects are standalone, but some of them can be condominiums that meet the AMI requirements within mixed-use projects. We have a project just like that in New Rochelle. And we're talking about other financing sources. New Rochelle has an inclusionary requirement, but if you are not including those affordable residences in your market rate, you can also pay into the kitty, and that kitty can be used to support affordable housing. And that's largely what's being done a lot in New Rochelle, is that these units are sort of being amassed together. The funds from the kitty are helping fill the gap, and then because they're doing them as standalone projects or large condos, they are benefiting from low-income housing tax credits. So very quickly, you can see there's the owner of the project, there's the manager, which ultimately falls up to the developer, and then in order to receive the tax credit benefit, as was mentioned, tax credit investor needs to own the project, but they'll have heavily negotiated, 100+ page documents with limited rights of the investor to step in to make sure that they get their tax credits, but otherwise they're a limited member and the developer is running the project. We mentioned, and I guess it'll be a whole nother topic next week, or on the next presentation, are pilots, but important to know that if there's a pilot, the structure is going to be slightly modified, typically, at least in New York, where the IDA, the Industrial Development Agency, either the county or the municipality, will actually have to own the property and then lease it back to the development entity and the project, such that it can legally be exempt from taxes, and there'll be a lease that sets forth the terms of how those payments in lieu of taxes are to be paid. Otherwise, the same structure. The other thing that I want to mention, so this is unique in New York for two things. In New York, we have what's called a Housing Development Fund Corporation. They existed before corporately, before the creation of low-income housing tax credits in 1986, and they have many benefits, the largest of which is mortgage recording tax. In New York, we have to pay taxes on mortgage, because in New York, you pay taxes on everything. Having an HDFC in your project, among other things, enables you to avoid mortgage recording tax. But what's important here, as you'll see, the HDFC is a not-for-profit, and in this model, on the left-hand side, the not-for-profit is in the development entity and has some rights with regard to that development entity. For some of the subsidies that Ayanna had mentioned, particularly HHAP funds, which are quote-unquote soft, meaning that they can be forgivable over time, HHAP requires that a not-for-profit be in the development entity, and not just in terms of its ownership interest, but it has to have real rights and control. And so if you're pursuing HHAP funds, homeless housing assistance project funds, and they are to be forgivable, which is most, if not all of them, then your not-for-profit partner, or if you're a not-for-profit, you, is going to have control, real control over the construction and then over the operations. And that's something that you need to know going up front. The last thing I wanted to say is this is just the model. If the IDA and the pilot is in that structure, so you can see it's just the same model with the HDFC, with a not-for-profit, and then also with a ground lease. I'm going to make these PowerPoints available. The last two things I want to say quickly about subsidy. So many on this call, I think, are obviously live in a community, may represent a community or municipality. One of the things that low-income housing tax credits can finance, which we've not discussed, is community facility space. And this is good from a community perspective because you need things like daycare, food pantries, senior care, etc. But they can also be good from a financial perspective because healthcare and clinics can be eligible for this funding. And so if you have a healthcare clinic tenant, you could have substantial rent for that space and also have it subsidized by low-income housing tax credits. I won't go into the requirements now, but you'll see there are specific requirements that have to be met in order for these portions of the project to be eligible for low-income housing tax credits, but they really can help a community and the finances. The last two things I'll say very quickly, I haven't been quick enough already, is in Westchester specifically, there are two other pockets of funding in addition to what has been mentioned in the state. And that is the new homes land acquisition financing and the housing implementation plan. So very quickly, new homes land acquisition financing is to pay for the acquisition. We all know housing prices in Westchester and Fairfield, or excuse me, land prices are very high. This really can help fill the gap, but you really need to talk to the county agency early on to make sure that this funding will be available and can be allocated. And then the last is there are parts of our community that are not, or where we want to develop that may not be in city centers or near transportation, as Ayanna and others have said, and infrastructure may need to be built, whether it is sewage systems, water, lighting, streeting, etc. And there is financing for that. Those funds have to flow through the municipality and will be required to be prevailing wage, which has its own complications, but really can sort of create opportunities where there are none because there's no infrastructure by filling that gap and funding the infrastructure.
Great, thank you, Jason. So from here,
Sorry, can I just chime in on one other thing? Just because I used to run an IDA. Sales tax exemption is another thing that I don't think I heard Jason mention, but that IDAs in New York can offer, which can greatly reduce your construction costs. It reduces the sales tax you pay on, or eliminates the sales tax you pay on construction materials.
really good point. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
So we're going to shift a little bit to talk about cost impacts in the previous year. And for this, we'd like to speak with Joanna Cuevas. Joanna, what are some of the things that you all are doing to mitigate the increased construction and operating costs that we've all been experiencing?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. We have seen increases in insurance premiums and utility costs as it relates to operating our buildings. And that has just been an ongoing issue and an ongoing discussion. In a lot of ways, having a tax abatement or a pilot, as has been presented, becomes really critical for projects, especially in the Westchester and Fairfield, Connecticut region, because we are a very high tax region. And so, in other areas where the real estate taxes aren't as high, you may be able to get away with doing a project without a pilot. But, in this region, that becomes really critical for the operations. And I think we'll get into that in such sessions in the Affordable Housing series. Another way that sometimes we look at mitigating operating costs is by having kind of shared property management staffing with projects that are within the same region or within close proximity to one another, so that basically you have a part-time manager and potentially an assistant project manager, in the budget for one project, but it's being shared with one or two other projects. There are a lot of issues with that, though. It's not always the best way to operate. Residents want to have full-time access to a property manager, so you really have to be able to mitigate that, and you really need economies of scale in terms of the number of units that you're operating when you do that. So, and they have to be close enough. The buildings have to be close enough to each other to really make that work and not have that be an additional strain on the staffing themselves. So I've seen that be an issue as well. We have also seen increase in construction costs, particularly related to COVID. It's always an issue, but I think this last year has really created additional increases, particularly to material costs. So I'm hearing lumber and steel are going up. So, there used to be a time when, you could say, oh, steel's really high, or, lumber's really high, let's do lightweight steel, instead of a but now you're just having increases all across the board. So that's something that we're really paying attention to. And also the supply of construction materials just has longer lead times, and in terms of fabrication lead times and things of that nature. So we're seeing potential increases in our construction period, which then increases our construction loan interest and everything, starts to escalate. In terms of construction, we found that it's really helpful to bring your GC or construction manager in early in the project, so that, even at schematic design, your construction team can be looking at costs, looking at, ways to economize, looking at local suppliers, things of that nature, rather than waiting until the end of design to bring on a construction team that, at that point, you don't have a lot of flexibility in what you can do to mitigate construction costs. So those are some ideas. Those are some challenges that we're seeing, just because of, our current situation with the pandemic. And again, these soft loans and gap financing sources are becoming ever more important to our deals, and ever more competitive. So,
Right.
So we'll see what 2021
Absolutely.
has to hold for us.
And at the risk of sounding as if I'm piling on the challenges, how about the effect of COVID on rental receipts? Have you seen an effect? And
yeah, absolutely. And I think this goes a little bit into the eviction moratoriums that have been in place as a result of COVID. We've been working through that. And I think a year ago, which is crazy to say, a year ago is when we started our pause. We were really just kind of scrambling and figuring it out. But looking at where we ended up at the end of 2020, I think what I've heard is that affordable housing has tended to fare better in terms of rent collections compared to market rate housing, just because the rents are sized in a way to allow for families to afford them, and affordable housing that has received rental subsidies like Section 8 vouchers or other rental subsidies have fared even better than just straight low-income housing tax credit projects. But in our portfolio, our resident collections have averaged around 93% of billed rent, which is down approximately 3 to 4% over a typical non-COVID year. So, we're faring okay, but we have still seen a reduction. the different forms of relief that have been available to our residents through states and cities and agencies last year have provided relief to cover about 80% of the balance due on their rent, which means that owners have had to agree to forgive approximately 20% of the unpaid rent, just kind of like on average for last year. So, that's just kind of the situation that we're in. There is a new COVID relief bill that was introduced in January. And I think, we are working with residents to try to access those funds. My understanding is that residents this time around need to prove a hardship due to COVID in order to qualify for the payments, which in some ways may make it a more equitable distribution because there were some folks who chose to pay their rent despite their financial difficulties. And I think the first bill didn't really address those who were just kind of trying to make it work and continue to pay their rent. I think this one may affect a wider range of folks who perhaps started last year with a job and now no longer have a job due to COVID. So we'll see how that goes.
Okay, great. That was a very in-depth answer. Ayanna, did you want to add just a little bit to that?
Sure, just to say that the rent relief program in New York is there to assist low-income households experiencing rent burden, and it's specific to the period of April 1st of 2020 to July 31st of 2020. And my understanding is that it did reach a number of families. It was, I don't remember what the initial deadline was, but it was extended because of the need. So that I think is really an indication of how challenging, the burden of the rent burden was for a number of families. But the application extension did just close February 1st of 2021.
Thank you.
Yep.
Great. Joanna, you mentioned the eviction moratorium. Can you speak just a little bit about how that's affected your operations?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the major impact is in the eviction moratorium is that we are prohibited from evicting anyone for any reason. It was very, very wide brush on that. So that means, folks who potentially were in an eviction process prior to COVID was put on halt. So it's now been a year. It also includes preventing us from evicting residents for serious lease violations like drug dealing, gang activity, violent crimes, things of that nature that would normally be an exception in these situations. So, in addition to some of the economic impacts, we have experienced some concerns regarding safety in our buildings, and realizing that there even if in some jurisdictions where we are able to evict for these serious violations, there's a backlog of cases, and we're waiting months to get a court date. Obviously, the eviction moratorium is there for a reason, and we do support that during times of pandemic. Obviously, we don't want to be rendering people without a home or a place to live during a pandemic. But we are aware as as building owners and working with our property managers that that there are some extenuating circumstances that we're just paying really close attention to right now.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. So I think we need to talk a little bit on the positive for a moment. And one thing positive is that interest rates have remained low. And, I think we all hope that they will continue to be low, but I wanted to get Drew's thoughts on on interest rates?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is always a difficult one to predict, and many people could make a whole lot of money if they were in a position to do just that. But I think all indicators that we see in our space definitely suggest that interest rates are going to remain low for some time. The ability for us to come out of the pandemic and move forward economically is going to require rates to continue to stay low. Just monetary policy wise, there's no other way. We're seeing a lot of different programs continue to come out of the agency lenders. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are always looking for ways to come up with new means to help facilitate new development, preservation, and refinancing in the affordable housing space, whether it includes LIHTCs or not. That's a huge part of the market, is just the ability for folks to refinance. And we definitely see that continuing, and that is going to help continue to support the stability of the investor space in the low-income housing tax credit community as well, because the banks and insurance companies who make up the bulk of the buyers of tax credits, a lot of these groups many are motivated by community reinvestment, which is obviously independent of economic returns in some regards, but for many of the groups, they're part of their alternative investment groups. So they're looking for ways to invest capital, and we're competing essentially with other yield-based returns. And with interest rates as low as they are, 6% return after tax is considered pretty decent for what is almost a default free asset class.
Great. Thank you. And we've received a couple questions, so we want to make sure that we get through those. So, we'll gladly go a few minutes over to make sure to cover. I want to go back to a question we received early on, and Ayanna, it would be great if you can answer it. The question is there any objective way to rate QAP submissions in meeting objectives?
Sure. I guess the first thing I would say is that it's really important to read carefully the language in the QAPs and to really understand, to really follow what they say, basically. And that might sound trite, but they are worded very carefully. And so it is really important when you're trying to maximize points to make sure that you're reading every section and understanding how you should go about trying to maximize points. Separate from that, I would say that, if you have an application and you have questions about how a particular thing might score, you can always give us a call, and we're happy to kind of walk through and give you some additional insight. But we sort of read every application and sort of look at it in accordance to the QAP and make our determinations that way. But they are as pretty detailed documents. So if you read them carefully and follow what they say, you should do well.
Great. And another question just came in. I'm going to do my best to start to answer it, but I welcome the panelists to join me as we read through this. But the question was posed, what's the typical percentage of affordable housing units in a LIHTC project? Well, as you all probably gather here today, it takes a team of professionals to be able to close on one of these deals due to all their complexity. And there are obviously costs associated with that. So, I would say the majority of the deals that we have done have really been in the 80 to 100% LIHTC units within a building, with one caveat that we did one that had 60% of the units. But that was unusual because we used 4% tax credits and then used some soft funding that was available to us in the city of Stamford. That's not widely, well, I shouldn't say what's just available in Stamford. So city of Stamford really gave us some opportunities that you don't usually find elsewhere to do that. So it's a very lengthy way of saying typically the majority of the units are LIHTC units because of the soft costs and expenses and complexity of the deal. Does anybody else want to add to that answer? Thumbs
I
up.
would just say, Caroline, I think you're correct in what you said.
Okay.
And just in general, the audience that's participating here, I think, is involved in what we consider to be capital A affordable housing, which is really deeply set aside for almost 100% of the project, if not always 100% of the project. So sometimes we'll see a handful of units that are unrestricted, but the financing, at least as for investors, anything that has fewer than 80% of the units that are fully restricted at 60% of AMI or below, typically is not something that we would even consider investing in. That's for a different audience in many cases.
Mhm. Right. That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, and
so-
I would
go
mention
ahead,
that, and maybe Ayana can speak to this better, but in New York, the state low-income housing tax credits, I think can be used for higher in affordability AMI. So I think up to 95%
yeah.
or 90% changes
Yeah.
with some of the QAPs. And in that situation, you would have a percentage that are using like the state low-income housing credits versus the federal low-income housing credits. And so, I've used that in the past as an opportunity to create a more diverse income band within a more mixed income, type project, but still obtaining subsidies.
Thanks, Joanna. And we'll take one last question. I might need a little help from our panelists on this one. Are we aware of funding sources aimed at specific low-income populations, such as artists?
Sure, I can take that one. So the answer is yes. You can have the IRS does allow for preferences for, let's say, veterans or artists. In terms of having a preference for artists, they do still need to meet the income restriction, whatever that is, and the AMI. And then typically, but I think it can be done differently depending on the municipality or the developer. There's, it's based on the not the quality of the work, but the income generated from the work as an artist. That's sort of how you're evaluated. And there would be an independent panel that would sort of interview and go through applications for artists' preference for specific affordable housing deals. But there is, when I was in New Rochelle, there was a developer who did just that. He had set asides for artists and artist preference. And I know that's also been done in certain developments in Long Island, and I believe in Peekskill, if I'm not mistaken, up somewhere in upstate.
Yeah, I did one in Long Island and Riverhead,
yeah.
Where we did exactly that. You have to be really careful about the marketing. You still need to meet the requirements of the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan. And then we did have a jury and panel review, and it was only a portion. I think it was a percentage set aside for artists. So it wasn't, the entire building.
Right.
Yeah. And from an investor standpoint, this is something that we've seen, and there's some groups that really specialize in this sort of niche. Art Space is actually a development group that's done a fair bit of this. They've got a fantastic project in East Harlem, actually, that was completed about 8 years ago, and has been on the cover of brochures, and is really sort of highlights what can be done and achieved from an architectural standpoint, from a public-private partnership standpoint. It's really, so there's some special stuff that's been done in kind of the subcategories targeting specific tenants like artists and veterans as well.
Great. Well, thank you. I feel like this has been a learning experience for me, so I appreciate all the feedback from our panelists representing so many different elements of affordable housing.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, ULI. Thank you to our attendees, most of whom hung on to the end.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Enjoy your afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.